things are going to have to be that way, right? So we're taking the two concepts that we talked about in isolation last week, and this is how they would be placed in context of a complete example. So we have the opening, and then we have the closing, okay? So now we just have to try to connect the dots in terms of the middle of each of these examples as best we can. So again, we can use the table at the bottom of the page here to figure out what some of our possibilities might be in terms of pitch content. So again, we can fill all of this out. Right, so those would be all of our consonant intervals above C, although again, we already know what our beginning and end are going to have to be in terms of that ending on C. Right, and then the rest of these, I'm just keeping notes that are in the key signature in this case. Okay. So since we already have the beginning and ending squared away, we don't necessarily have to worry about those particular pitches. So one other thing to point out that I know a couple folks missed, I think, on the homework assignment is, again, once you have these down, double check to make sure that all of the pitches that you have in this table are in fact consonant harmonic intervals. So there is one interval in this case above D natural that would in fact be a dissonance. Can anybody identify what that would be? Which of those pitches above D would be a dissonant harmonic interval? Yeah, the D to the A flat, Amelia. Good, that would be a diminished fifth. So in that case, that would be a no-go. So just as a reminder, when we're in major modes, which we had seen last time, that tritone exists between scale degrees 4 and 7, or Fa and T for those of you that are solfege folks. So in the minor mode then, right, if we're in the key of C minor, and we just identified a diminished fifth between D and A flat, what scale degrees are D and A flat in the key of C minor? What scale degree is D natural in the key of C minor? Just start there. 2, thank you. And what scale degree is A flat? So A flat would not be scale degree 5 metal, that would be G, so it would be 6, yeah. Scale degree 6. So these are the intervals that if you have one of those two scale degrees in your cantus firmus to watch out for in terms of the use of those dissonant harmonic intervals, right? Because those fifths above those particular pitches are going to be considered dissonant. So just so we're watching out. So in the major mode, it's always going to be 4 and 7. In the minor mode, it's always going to be 2 and 6. You're good, Madeline, don't worry. Okay, so now as we are working on filling in some of this information, again, we can apply some of the same tricks that we had talked about last time around. So first of all, let's go error by error here and see if we can fix some of the issues that we came up with previously. So let's start with the approach into the cadence that we had identified as a problem in the first example. So we don't want a diminished harmonic interval. So even though that E flat is a consonant, we don't want to use that in terms of our approach into the penultimate measure, because that's going to create a dissonance. We would also want to avoid, in this case, the B flat, even though that would be a consonant, because otherwise we're going to create a line that's going to sound too chromatic for this particular style. We have like B flat to B natural to C natural. It's going to sound a little bit too funky, I think, for this particular time period. So in this instance, we would want to approach with either C or E flat, or sorry, C or G. And in this instance, I think one trick that we can use, if we have that skip of a third in the bass, one of the tricks that we can employ is something that we talked about last week. So if I choose to write C natural here, first of all, that'd be parallel 6 from measure to measure. And if I start to write that, anybody tell me what the implication would be then of the note that we would want before that C natural? Yeah, E flat. Because this is creating, anybody remember what we call this? Not cross voicing, voice exchange, right? Yeah, voice crossing is actually an error, right? When you have the registers of both voices crossing one another. So if the lower voice moves above the upper voice or vice versa. Voice exchange, however, is actually a thing that we want to try to do whenever we can, right? So this would be one particular way of working through this. So I think anytime you find those skips, where intervals would be able to be consonants above the given pitch that you have, I think that these kinds of voice exchanges are always a nice thing to be able to try and utilize. And then we can see again another way that we can work through an error would be to go back to the beginning here, right? So one of the errors that we saw in the first setting was the use of consecutive perfect intervals at the opening. So that means we can eliminate right off the bat the use of G on beat 2. So that leaves us with either B flat, D, or E flat as some options here above our given bass note. So any of those would potentially work as far as our next pitch goes. So any thoughts as to which one we might want to try and use there? Okay, we could try D natural. Yeah, and stepwise motion, right? Conjunct motion is always a good thing, right? Whenever we can use that, that's always nice. And especially whenever you are approaching a perfect consonant like this, remember you want the stepwise motion in the upper voice and the leap in the lower voice. So this is a similar motion into that perfect interval, but with the stepwise motion in the upper voice, that would be considered okay. Okay, so if we choose D natural there, that fifth, then as we move into our next pitch, that's going to eliminate C natural as an option. Why? Why can't we do this? Yeah, parallel perfect intervals, right? So we always want to try to avoid that. So again, we can understand that, obviously your own table would be unique as you're kind of going through it with your own thing, but you can understand how making a decision in one measure is going to affect the possibilities that you can then use in the next measure. So in terms of our options, right, we have F, A flat, and D natural remaining. A flat we can also eliminate as a possibility. So in this instance, right, this would be a leap from D down to A flat, and we are prepping that with stepwise motion in the opposite direction, which is what we would want to do. But what is the interval from D to A flat?
Your team has destroyed a turret.
It is a fourth, but D to A natural would actually be a perfect fourth. So this would be not a diminished fourth, but rather an augmented fourth, yeah. Tritone is what we can more colloquially refer to that as, right? So that tritone interval from D to A flat. So if D to A natural is a perfect fourth and we're lowering A to A flat, that's increasing the size of that fourth by a half step. That's why it would be augmented. So even though A flat would be a consonant harmonic interval above F, since we wrote D natural as our pitch on beat 2, that's going to remove that as a possibility in terms of what we can write in measure 3. That makes sense? Okay, so we can write F as an option if we want to. In this instance, since this would be another octave, we would have to make sure that we were approaching that in contrary motion. So we could either do that or use oblique motion by keeping the D natural consistent, which would give us a 6th. I'm going to opt in this case to keep the F natural there, just because I think it's always best to try to avoid oblique motion whenever possible. However, that would be a possibility if we wanted to include that. Okay, so that's where we are on beat 3. So now as we look at beat 4, our possibilities above E flat, right, we would eliminate E flat as an option, because that would result in parallel octaves if we were to write the E flat there. Right? So we wouldn't want to do that. And now that we're getting kind of close to what we've written there at the end, we want to see if we can start to work our way towards meeting these things in the middle and connecting the dots. So one thing that we could do in this instance, and again, just as a way of kind of thinking this through, since the interval that we're looking at from here to here is the same as what we did with the voice exchange later, if we wanted to, this is maybe a little bit boring, but could still be functional, it'd do the same thing as far as the voice exchange goes, just on a larger scale. Right, so same exact voice exchange, but with that stepwise motion filling in that skip that we can see we're moving to directly at the other end of that. So again, this is a little bit, like I said, a little bit repetitive, maybe a little bit boring, but would be considered functional. And we can see in this case, we do have this leap of a perfect fourth, which is fine, which is being prepped and resolved with stepwise, well, a skip and then stepwise motion in the opposite direction. So that would be considered a decent leap treatment there. Okay, that makes sense what we just came up with in that example? So this would be one complete setting or one complete way to kind of deal with this. So does that make sense kind of how we're problem solving our way through this? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and play this for us just so we can get a sense of what it sounds like, and then we'll move on to the other handout that I have for us for today. Let's take a listen. So that would be one complete set. Any questions about this example before we move on? So is the Harry Potter rule thing not really a rule? No, it is. That's what we were just referring to. The only leap that we actually wrote in this case would be here, right, which we are prepping and resolving with contrary motion. So the skip is an acceptable replacement for the step in terms of preparation and resolution for a leap. Yeah, that only applies for leaps. So anytime you're doing steps or skips, well, steps primarily, right? You can kind of go in any direction that you want to. Leaps are what you have to be careful of. And then we go for 2 consecutive skips as well, right? Because 2 consecutive skips is also going to add up to 1 total leap. So you have to be careful about how you're treating those as well. But yeah, the Harry Potter thing is only for leaps. Other questions? Okay, so let's take a look then at this last first species example that I have for us here. So again, this should be in the week 11 folder on Blackboard. Okay, so in this case, and I don't know why I didn't fill this out before, but the octave in this instance would be the same notes as the actual cantus firmus itself. I'll just copy these in for us. So the implication in this case is that we would be in the key of C major, given that we have no accidentals in the key signature, and we're starting and ending on C. And so that would be the implication in terms of the key area there. So we want to look in this case, again, at all of our consonant harmonic intervals. But at any time that you are using the same pitch, you can always copy the same harmonic intervals in each case. So those would be all of the possible consonant harmonic intervals. And before we get too far along, are there any dissonant harmonic intervals that exist above the notes of the cantus firmus in this case, based off of what we've written? Remember, we're in a major mode now. So what are the two scale degrees that we're needing to look out for when we're in the major mode in terms of dissonant harmonic intervals? Yeah, 4 and 7. And so we can see in this case that we do have a couple of instances of scale degree 4 in the cantus firmus. But in this instance, since we have the cantus firmus in the lower voice, the fifth above scale degree 4 is going to be scale degree 1. And so if we were using this in the upper voice, then a fifth below that would be scale degree 7. And in that case, that would be considered your dissonant harmonic interval. But in this case, we're in the clear given that the cantus firmus is in the lower voice. Okay, so any of these would be fair game technically. So once again, I think as we're working on composing this, we want to start with the beginning and the end, given that those are going to be non-negotiable items. So again, we'll start off here with that same octave that we would expect. And as we look at the end, again, we want to make sure that we're getting our cadence set up correctly. And so we know, again, we have to end with that octave on C. And since we have D to C in the lower voice, what pitch do we want in this measure in the upper voice? D natural, yeah. And do we need any accidentals in this case? No, because again, in the major mode, scale degree 7 is already going to be functioning as the leading tone. Right? It's in the minor mode that we have to raise that pitch another half step to get that to function correctly. Okay. All right, questions so far? So we've got our bookends, and now we're just going to try to connect the dots as well as we can. So first of all, if we want to try to use some of the same sort of tricks that we were just talking about in our previous example, we could try to look for some of those same kind of voice exchange possibilities. Does anybody see any skips or unfoldings of the interval of a third where we might be able to use a similar kind of voice exchange pattern to what we were doing in the previous example? Or a couple points on this here where we might be able to do something like that. Yeah, so 7 and 8 over here. Wanted to do something like that, perhaps. Sure, so that'd be one place that we could do that. where's another one? Just so we're all kind of on the same page. Where's another location where we might be able to do something like that? Okay. And there is, in fact, another one that we could do as well. We see. The last one that I think we could also do would be right here at the very beginning. Right where we could fill in that gap of a third with stepwise motion. And this is also following the leap rule that we were just talking about. So again, we have that ascending leap, which we're contrasting with stepwise motion in the opposite direction. Right, so we can see in this case, again, by using that little voice exchange concept, that we've knocked out a decent chunk of this example already. So there are a couple of other considerations that we'll talk about a little bit later in this unit. Again, right now, I'm just concerned with us getting progressions that work from a functional standpoint. Again, this, I think, is ultimately maybe a little too repetitive. But I think in terms of what we're trying to come up with for our functional kind of progressions here, this would work okay. So in terms of the connection then, we just need to make sure that we're connecting our dots here between measures. So first of all, from G to E here, at this point we'd be looking at this part of the cantus firmus, right above A natural. And so what might we try to use in terms of some pitches then above the A natural to connect the dots there? Emma says C, which we could do, right? So we have, in that case, that would be a leap in the opposite direction, which is being prepped and resolved with skips in the opposite direction. This is starting, I think if we're looking at this whole thing though, however, right, as we're starting to look at that whole 5-measure chunk, this may be starting to get a little bit too disjunct, right? We might need to get some kind of stepwise motion in there at some point. So that might be a little bit too leapy, skippy for that long of a stretch. So might want to try something else. Do F again, which would be a 6th. The only issue that I see with this, and again, this is getting into some stuff that we'll talk about later. For our purposes now, we can leave F natural, which would be right good as far as conjunct motion goes. The issue here is that we're repeating the same little 3-measure chunk back to back, right? So this would start to get maybe a little too repetitive, right? We want to try to get some variety in there, and we'll hear this in a second that this is going to sound a bit repetitive, but for our purposes of trying to look at some of these larger examples, we can leave that for now. And so let's try to figure out in this instance how we can connect the dots now from the end of the previous voice exchange to our cadence. So again, we just have these couple of notes to look at, which would be this section of the cantus firmus. So there's a couple of different ways that we can go about this, but I think in this instance, since we have this ascending skip, we know that we're probably going to have to get some descending motion at some point to get back into this ending here. Again, there are several different ways that we could potentially connect these dots here. So does anybody have any thoughts as to what pitches we might use in one or both of those measures? could leap down to F or A. The only issue with that is what type of interval is that from G to A? That's a seventh, right? And remember, we're trying to avoid dissonant melodic intervals larger than a step. So in this instance, we could potentially move up by step towards A, which would give us another third. And so if we were to do something like that, then we would just need to watch how we're getting into our final cadence point here. So I see one potential solution in terms of a note that we could use in this bar if we wanted to use A for measures from the end.